Now, folk always wonder how long this goes on, this big agenda and who's in it and all the rest of it. And they don't understand. You've got to read H.G. Wells's books. The Outline of History was one good book with part 1 and 2, because he gives you the Fabian outline of the types of the race, he calls it, that will survive and be brought through when others die off. And it was written a long, long time ago. It's based on eugenics, of course. And he tells you the different groups who've proven themselves down through time as survivors who will be in on it. And, of course, a lot of this was also exposed by Professor Carroll Quigley, who believed in this system that ruled the world and does rule the world and their agenda. And from the Wise Up Journal, it says here, How the World Operates by President Wilson and respected historian Quigley. Now, Wilson was a front man, as they all are. Presidents are front men, you see, for the advisors behind them. And you'll find that Colonel Mandel House, who was not a colonel, it was an honorary title, he was a go-between for the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the Milner Group, and Lord Grey, who was for Britain, you see, to bring in the U.S. system, to make sure it was the same system as Britain. And Wilson was man-picked for the job to be the front. And so they gave the Federal Reserve and the income taxes laws all in time for World War I, of course, which they all had planned as well. Anyway, it says here, Wise Up Journal, the 13th of June. The following extracts are from 2 books, one by World War I President Woodrow Wilson, and the other from an eminent professor and noted historian Carroll Quigley, whom Bill Clinton thanked in his 1992 presidential Democrat acceptance speech. It was more than that, though, Quigley. He was also an advisor to the State Department, the Pentagon, and a whole bunch of government offices and positions on history and ethnology for different cultures that they went to go off and bomb. It says, did these men think childishly that powerful families have influence over corporate business and governments, or do we believe childishly that powerful families don't? And here's an extract from Woodrow Wilson's The New Freedom, which was written. By the way, The New Freedom was quoted by George Bush, remember, Jr., when he says he was giving you the new freedom. And I said at the time it was a new definition of freedom, and it was actually from the New Freedom book that was outlined back in 1913 by Wilson. That was the front man, as I say, who helped bring in the League of Nations. At least he fronted for it. It says, since I entered politics, I've chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of somebody and are afraid of something. They know that there's a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they'd better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. Carroll Quigley wrote about this power in his history book entitled Tragedy and Hope. But he was not against it, as he stated in the book. He said, I have no aversion to it or most of its aims, and have for much of my life been close to it and to many of its instruments. And some extracts from Tragedy and Hope are here. 1966 it was published. Indeed, some of them intended to contribute to both and to allow an alternation of 2 parties in public office in order to conceal their own influence. So they had 2 parties, again, to confuse the public. Inhibit any exhibition of independence by politicians, and allow the electorate to believe that they were exercising their own free choice. In 1924, J.P. Morgan was able to sit back with a feeling of satisfaction to watch a presidential election in which the candidates of both parties were in his sphere of influence. Usually Morgan had to share his political influence with other sectors of the business oligarchy, especially with the Rockefeller interest, as was done, for example, by dividing the ticket between them. The power of investment bankers over governments. The power of investment bankers over governments rests on a number of factors, of which the most significant perhaps is the need for governments to issue short-term treasury bills as well as long-term government bonds. Just as businessmen go to commercial banks for current capital advances to smooth over the discrepancies between their irregular and intermittent incomes and their periodic and persistent outgoes, such as monthly rents, annual mortgage payments, and weekly wages, so government has to go to the merchant bankers or institutions controlled to hide them or tide them over the shallow places caused by irregular tax receipts. Back after this break. Hi folks, this is Alan Watworth cutting through the matrix talking about Carroll Quigley's book Tragedy and Hope and other articles from the book put out by President Wilson, who worked for the same boys who still run the world today. Both these guys did, and they were all for it, of course. And this is here that the government had to use these banks to basically tide them over when tax receipts were slow in coming in. And they know themselves, of course, the big corporations don't pay taxes. They postpone them for 15, 20 years and then write them off when they move to another country. But that's the corporate welfare. But I mean, they get grants given to them whenever they say they're failing. You know, it's a con game. It was set up by them. And there's never been any sort of Republican democracy in the U.S. It was, at least from the late 1800s onwards. Anyway, it says here, this is so widely accepted even today that in 1961, a Republican investment banker became Secretary of the Treasury in a Democratic administration in Washington without significant comment from any direction, because it says previously that they put these guys in charge of a lot of their administrative positions in government, these bankers, these merchant bankers. The key international banking families, the names of some of these banking families are familiar to all of us and should be more so. They include the Rehring, Lazard, Erlanger, Warburg, Schroeder, Seligman, the Spires, Mirabaud, Mallet, Fold, and above all Rothschild and Morgan. They've got the Jacob Schiffs and all the rest of them in there too. Even after these banking families became fully involved in domestic industry by the emergence of financial capitalism, they remained different from ordinary bankers in distinctive ways. They were cosmopolitan and international. They were close to governments and were particularly concerned with questions of government debts, including foreign government debts, even in areas which seemed at first glance poor risks like Egypt, Persia, Ottoman, Turkey, Imperial China, and Latin America. Their interests were almost exclusively in bonds and very rarely in goods, since they admired liquidity and regarded commitments in commodities or even real estate as a first step towards bankruptcy. They were accordingly fanatical devotees of deflation, which they called sound money from its close associations with high interest rates and a high value of money, and of the gold standard which, in their eyes, symbolized and ensured these values. 5. They were almost equally devoted to secrecy and the secret use of financial influence in political life. These bankers came to be called international bankers, and more particularly were known as merchant bankers in England, private bankers in France, and investment bankers in the United States. In all countries they carried on various kinds of banking and exchange activities, but everywhere they were sharply distinguishable from other more obvious kinds of banks such as savings banks or commercial banks. The dynasties of international bankers. In time, they brought into their financial network the provincial banking centers, organized as commercial banks and savings banks as well as insurance companies, to form all these into a single financial system on an international scale, which manipulated the quantity and flow of money so that they were able to influence, if not control, governments on one side and industries on the other. The men who did this, looking backward towards a period of dynastic monarchy in which they had their own roots, by the way, aspired to establish dynasties of international bankers and were at least successful at this, as were many of the dynastic political rulers. The greatest of these dynasties, of course, were the descendants of the Meyer-Amschel Rothschild of Frankfurt family, whose male descendants for at least 2 generations generally married first cousins or even nieces. They still do. Rothschild's 5 sons established the branches in Vienna, London, Naples, and Paris, as well as Frankfurt, cooperated together in ways in which other international banking dynasties copied but rarely excelled. As early as 1909, Walter Rathenau, who was in a position to know, since he had inherited from his father control of the German General Electric Company and held scores of directorships himself, said, 300 men, all of whom know each other, direct the economic destiny of Europe and choose their successors from amongst themselves. Big banking and business controlled the federal government. The structure of financial controls created by the tycoons of big banking and big business to the period 1880 to 1933 was of extraordinary complexity. One business fief being built on another, both being allied with semi-independent associates. The whole rearing upward into two pinnacles of economic and financial power, of which one centered in New York was headed by J.P. Morgan and Company, and the other in Ohio was headed by the Rockefeller family. By 1930, these 200 largest corporations held 49.2% of the assets of all 40,000 corporations in the country. That's the U.S. In fact, in 1930, one corporation, American Telephone and Telegraph, controlled by Morgan, had greater assets than the total wealth in 21 states of the Union. The influence of these business leaders was so great that the Morgan and Rockefeller groups acting together, or even Morgan acting alone, could have wrecked the economic system of the country. Actually, they did it three times in the later 1800s. They basically got together, crashed the economy, bought up everything that was real business for peanuts, and consolidated them into corporations. And this following extract from Tragedy and Hope shows a view of war different from the normal mind. The agrarian discontent, the growth of monopolies, the oppression of labor, and the excesses of Wall Street financiers made the country very restless and looking about for some issue which would distract public discontent from domestic economic issues. What better solution than a crisis in foreign affairs? Cleveland had stumbled upon this alternative more or less accidentally in 1895 when he stirred up a controversy with Great Britain over Venezuela. The great opportunity, however, came with the Cuban revolt against Spain in 1895. While the Yellow Press, led by William Randolph Hearst, roused public opinion, Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt plotted how they could best get the United States into the fracas. They got the excuse they needed when the American battleship Maine was sunk by a mysterious explosion in Havana Harbor in February 1898. By the way, they actually found the Maine and found it blew up from within in its engine room. In 2 months, the United States declared war on Spain to fight for Cuban independence. The resulting victory revealed the United States as a world naval power, established it as an imperialist power with possessions in Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, and whetted some appetites for imperialist glory. The last extract was taken from near the end of the book on page 950, and it sums up the situation we're caught in and shows the highly respected historian's viewpoint on it. By the way, Quigley took these from the records of the Council on Foreign Relations. They have their own private, public history library for themselves, on themselves. It says there does exist and has existed for a generation an international Anglophile network. It doesn't mean they're actually English. It means they live in England and the east coast of the US, which operates to some extent in the way the radical right believes the Communists act. In fact, this network, which we may identify as round table groups, has no aversion to cooperating with the Communists or any other groups and frequently does so. I know of the operations of this network because I've studied it for 20 years and was permitted for 2 years in the early 1960s to examine papers and secret records. I have no aversion to it or most of its aims and have for much of my life been close to it and to many of its instruments. I read a part the other night from that. I've objected both in the past and recently to a few of its policies, notably to the belief that England was an Atlantic rather than a European power and must be allied or even federated with the United States and must remain isolated from Europe. But in general, my chief difference of opinion is that it wishes to remain unknown, and I believe its role in history is significant enough to be known. And then there's more and more stuff about that, you see. But let's go into President Wilson's book, you see, because he loved to talk. In fact, he used to put people to sleep at the table by talking, especially about himself. But anyway, he was a good front man. And he wrote the book, The New Freedom, that George Bush quoted when he gave it to America. He was given a new definition of a new freedom. And the contents are, the old order changeth. He's talking about going from an old system of independence and independent people to all working together on a big enterprise for, the banks. What is progress, he says. Then, chapter 3, free men need no guardians. Life comes from the soil, the parliament of the people. That was for the World Parliament. He led it for the League of Nations. Let there be lights. The tariff, protection, or special privileges. He wanted to go into the British idea of free trade, an amalgamation of the Americas. They called it the Pan-American Union, and Britain was to do the same with the European Union. Monopoly or opportunity. He was want to think that we should encourage monopolies and actually see them as opportunities. Benevolence or justice. The way to resume is to resume. The emancipation of business. He wanted to give them, the big boys, of course not for small business, but the big boys, the monopolies, more powers in the world and in their country. And then the liberation of our people's vital energies. That's so you could all work in factories. And the first part is that the old order changeth. So he goes through the ideas of the old system won't work anymore. This is a new America, he says. He says, we're in the presence of a new organization of society. Our life has broken away from the past. The life of America is not the life that it was 20 years ago. It's not the life that it was 10 years ago. We've changed our economic conditions absolutely from top to bottom because the big bankers took over. And with our economic society, the organization of our life. The old political formulas do not fit the present problems. They read now like documents taken out of a forgotten age. He was talking about scrapping the Constitution, you understand. The older cries sound as if they belong to a past age which men have almost forgotten. The things which used to be put into the party platforms of 10 years ago would sound antiquated if put into a platform now. We're facing the necessity of fitting a new social organization, as we did once fit the old organization to the happiness and prosperity of the great body of citizens. For we're conscious that the new order of society has not been made to fit and provide the convenience or prosperity of the average man. The life of the nation has grown infinitely varied. It does not center now upon questions of governmental structure or of the distribution of governmental powers. It centers upon questions of the very structure and operation of society itself. See, you're going from individualization, what you don't do is yourselves as individuals, to the organized society. That was a big idea that came out of England and the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Milner Society. And that's what he's telling you. He said, of which government is only the instrument. Our development has run so fast and so far along the lines sketched in the earlier days of the constitutional definition, has so crossed and interlaced those lines, has piled upon them such novel structures of trust and combination, has elaborated within them a life so manifold, so full of forces which transcend the boundaries of the country itself and fill the eyes of the world, that a new nation seems to have been created, which the old formulas do not fit or afford a vital interpretation of. We've come upon a very different age from that before us. We've come upon an age when we do not do business in the way in which we used to do business, when we do not carry on any of the operations of manufacture, sale, transportation, or communication as men used to carry them on. There's a sense in which in our day the individual has been submerged. In most parts of our country, men work not for themselves, not as partners in the old ways, which they used to, but generally as employees. He's pushing the employee culture, actually, employees in the big corporations and factories are all around. That's what he's pushing, you see, and all working together. This great endeavor to all work together for the better people who know better, you see. And that's what his whole book basically is about. And he did the book obviously, hand in glove with the Milner Group and Lord Grey, as he has contact with the British system. And it's well worth a read if you get a hold on it. It's all propaganda, all of it, but it tells you how they're bringing this into a new system where corporations would employ many thousands of people and be sort of benevolent dictators over their people who work for them, in a sense. So that was what, and then he also wanted to bring down the tariffs of protection and allow the country to be flooded with competition. He said you don't need to fear competition, because it was in for the free trade idea that Britain was already pushing and had been for a while, the free trade idea, you see. So, you think you're living through the changes now? Well, you are, but it was redesigned a long time ago, and you have been for over 100 years. In fact, Quigley said that these guys were the guys who gave you the main wars that you've lived through. He also said that they'd already been running the presidents of the United States for 60 years, and he wrote his book, Tragedy and Hope, in 1966. He says, all parties, he says. It doesn't matter the party that you vote for. And remember too, the elite themselves, even though they will bring on disasters like world wars or oil slicks or whatever else it happens to be, have already prepared for themselves their own survival. As you'll even see in their disaster movies, they give lottos and you can pick a stick or whatever to see if you can get in there if you're one of the ordinary people at the bottom. But for themselves, they've got them all designed that they're to survive in their pre-made underground cities and all the rest of it while you perish. They always have these contingency plans right down through the last 100-odd years for themselves. I remember one of the first ones that they showed that in was a movie. It was called Deep Impact, where an asteroid comes in. This is before they came up with global warming. And at the end, all the scientific elite are the ones who were, destined to survive because they were brighter and they need them for a new future. They'd get into the underground cities, but they gave a few lotto extra seats for the ordinary people. And the rest of them just had to take their fate on the surface and get smashed to smithereens. These are all predictive programming, and folk don't even know it.